A couple of nights ago, I watched a Zoom from the Oxford Martin School of the Future, and it was the great Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who has written an absolutely monumental book about the ages of globalization. And I won't go into the detail of it all now, but it is a tremendous work of academic industry, for one thing, and at the same time, much more than anything one can normally read, pulls together the various phases of change across the world, the way the empires were getting on with their own thing, while other empires were often unaware or then unkindly clashing into them and so forth. And it's a tremendous read. And finally, it gets to the modern age. And the modern age, as we know, is marked by many, many instabilities. There are the political and the social and the economic instabilities. There are the ecological instabilities, global warming probably, the depletion, irreversible depletion of the Earth's living biomass. And there, of course, the opportunity of more pandemic instabilities. And as we know, everything may be altered slightly if Mr. Trump doesn't win the next election in a few days' time, and it'll all get rather worse and rather more dangerous and rather more unstable if he does. And at the end of this, sort of talk, you come to a point of winding up, where the great professor says, in so many words, and so did Jeffrey Sachs, what we need is better institutions for cooperation, for global cooperation. And well, we know what happened to them. The United Nations was formed in a period of immense optimism after the most ghastly of wars. And its optimism has now worn pretty thin, and it can be pushed that way by the vetoes of the main powers and be abused for all sorts of other reasons. And bits of it, like the WHO, have already been subverted in a radical way, and so on. And as for the previous attempt, well, that was the League of Nations, and that was formed in a period much more like ours. And it was pulled apart by the American refusal to cooperate and the tensions created by the German and Italian fascists. So really, these new institutions which people dream of, I wouldn't attach much hope to them. But is there any other way that the world might react? After all, we've made an enormous occupation of the world in recent centuries, for instance, since we brought in the agricultural revolution as the basis of our ecology. And things happen when you get a container of limited capacity like the Earth, and you stuff it and stuff it and stuff it with people, processes and things. And in the past, we've done this. We have, we invented the agricultural revolution and stuffed the world with farmers and their associated craftsmen and so forth. We globalized that ecology. And the world didn't fall apart. And instead, it stabilized in a certain sense. And if you look at the world that we've got now, people tell themselves that, oh, well, we have infinite energy resting in the sun, but actually we are only capable of taking that part of the energy of the sun, which the circumference of our world allowed. The rest of it, all the other infinite quantities, are going off into open space. And even if you look at nuclear power, which is in a sense reciprocating the power that drives the sun, it is not an easily controllable beast. and although very useful in stabilizing systems of otherwise, well, our energetic systems, um, um, and particularly when the wind dies down or the sun dies down. So they have their part in the new order as well as the old order of energy. They are, in fact, well, they pose terrible problems of how do you get rid of the waste and so on and so on and so forth. They're not, so there is no, we are in a world of limited capacity, and we've stuffed it with people and processes and things. And is it just going to go on and go on quarreling worse and worse with itself? One of the professor's punchlines was that ecological revolutions lead invariably to conflict. Is that all we can do? Well, have we any kind of marker which might either confirm or corroborate that? And there's a very interesting marker provided by art history. Now, art history is traditionally a matter of looking very closely at single images. And over the last 500 years, a great number of scholars have been doing that. And they have evolved a kind of canon. The world knows which are the important paintings, more or less, and there's lots of delightful disagreement about the less important ones. New artists are always coming along, and contemporary art keeps the argument going. But basically, the overall last 40,000 years of art history, the trajectory is known. It's not recognized properly because art history has been so much to the picture, to the individual picture. People are not in the habit of looking at the way the curve of art history unfolds. But it is a curve. It is it rocks and rolls between two different kinds of art. One is ritualistic art, and the other is the aesthetic. And the aesthetic art is a kind of, well, all art is a glue, but aesthetic art is a weak glue. It doesn't impel you. It doesn't impose any kind of consensuality on. You can have your choice. If you choose not to like Michelangelo, bad luck Michelangelo, and possibly bad luck you as well. But that's it leaves people their freedom. Ritualistic art doesn't. Ritualistic art is about a necessary consensuality about what the world is. It's part of our existential apparatus. And so how otherwise, why otherwise, where the huge amounts of then available capital deployed in the caves, for instance, which lasted for thousands and thousands of years, constantly being used and constantly being reinforced and enriched. And again, when the agrarian period arrived with its temples and its tombs, which are very much part of the apparatus, and that in its turn provided an envelope for a world which was essentially about the expert use of hands and the control of machines which could be controlled by hands. And that was a world vulnerable to the winds and sun and disease, and all these things could be given names and prayed to and wrestled with and told stories about. And it was a world that thus became intelligible to those who lived in it, and which used, if you like, negative capability, to use Keats's term, to manage itself. Looking at the way that that curve rocks and rolls, you're left wondering, why do we go from the ritualistic to the aesthetic, to the ritualistic to the aesthetic? Of course, it reflects what is going on in the human ecology. We go through, we are the first species capable of actually changing its own ecology, resisting life's challenges by driving our methods of production upwards in terms of productivity, not in terms of virtue, nothing about virtue. It's just economic practicality. And when the Ice Age came to an end, for instance, that led to a great melt, the flood, and then a great drying out. And secondly, it greatly disadvantaged the old hunters-gatherers, whose method of survival was based on seizing the opportunities of a world which was disappearing. And the hunters-gatherers and even more the new agrarians between them polished off the old meat animals, the mastodons and the beef and the saber-toothed tigers and so forth, the edible creatures of the ancient world. And at the same time, the climate changed, and that changed what you could gather, and it made it much more advantageous to plant. And planting brought a different set of behaviors. Once you planted your field, you wanted to own it and not have your neighbor trade over it. And so huge differences in culture appeared. But the real thing, the really important thing, I think, is that there were these waves in art represent waves in globalization. As a new ecology arrived, so a new set of ritualistic centers was set up to manage the risks involved, albeit, as I said, by negative energy, not by rationality. Even today, we manage much of our lives by negative energy rather than by rationality, or the whole thing would be unbearable. And so you get emerging this process of the ecology changes, the art frees up and then settles down as the ecology settles down again. And the ecology settles down because each new advantage, new ecological advantage that some small population creates, once it's propagated across the world, the enormous plenty that came with it is diluted because everyone is competing for the same set of resources. And so we get an ecological stabilization, and you get the emergence of an art which tries to deal with that. So we've had these centuries of cave art and then temple art. And now, what is so interesting, we seem to be approaching the end of a phase of aesthetic art, which is all about explosive ecological change, and the art itself is in transition, is in phase transition from the aesthetic art to forms which are more, in one way or another, collectivist, forms in which the experience and participatory, forms in which the experience of the world is shared, and rather than seen uniquely by one eye. Wonderful those eyes were, but in the end, we live in a shared world, and it's now getting very, very important because we are filling it up. And so there is something to be seen, something to be thought about in what seems to be this pattern of psychological gravitation, that we settle first for a long time into a hunting-gathering ecology, and then we broke out of that, we're driven out of that as much as anything else by global warming. which is an interesting thought. And the old gravitational envelope of belief was blown apart, and then in turn was replaced by a new gravitational envelope of belief. So you have periods of weak gravity when you're breaking out, and then strong gravity when you have globalized the new ecology. And we have seen in the modernization of Western art, the period of the last sort of 150 years or so, that breaking down of the breaking out, the eventual deconstruction of the breaking out mechanism of art of individual choice, of weak glue, and the beginning of the formation of the engines of a strong glue, installation art, and contextual art, as art pushes back into the earth from which it came and starts to play games again with the universe in which it lives, in which we live. Of course, how that will change, what that will result in from the point of view of a reborn religion or some system of consensuality and celebration which spreads around the world, and whether it will produce some terrible tale of inner pathos, as the crucifixion of Christ, to hook the psyches of people onto it in a very profound way, or even a very strong authoritarianism, as in Islam, with a range of specific habits evolved for everyone, not just for the imams, whereas the Christian church, a lot of the specific habits are reserved for the clerics, and then we come in on the weekend. So really we're on the edge, I believe. I don't think we're going to solve our difficulties with institutions. We're going to solve our difficulties not with politicians, but in the end with artists. Artists are really, you could call the fifth estate, and they're the freest of them all. There was, if you remember the old sort of dictionary, the first estate was the aristocracy. Well, they were bound by their possessions and their rank and their hierarchy, the rigidities of their hierarchy and their obligations to a king. The second estate was the church, and that was bound to feudal, bound to religious systems of belief and unfree. And then there were the people, and they were the third estate, and they were bound to the conditions of the poverty which trapped most of them into some kind of feudal order. And then there was the fourth estate, the press, journalists who were free to roam, but at the end were pulled in by the wires of their proprietors, where however far they traveled, were in a sense the puppets of the newspaper owners. And then there are artists who are free to imagine as their imaginations freely flow. And there is something very remarkable, very unresearched about the capacity of artists to find their own world within them and express it externally. It is something to do with the very, very concentrated creative act. I could go out now into the garden and paint you a beautiful pot of flowers, had I had the paint box and a few art classes at school. And that could give you pleasure, as though there's a pot of flowers in your own garden, and you didn't have to water it because it hung on the wall. But this is not something done with an existential intensity. And one of the things that science needs to think about and look at, I think, is the way the brain produces art. And this is not a matter of replicators. Dawkins had a brilliant idea with the meme, because as a quantum of communication, we all communicate in memes, to give it a word, but the meme is not a replicator of the gene. It is not purely a replicator. And otherwise, we'd still not be using the alphabet. We'd still not be, we haven't got round to Shakespeare. We still wouldn't have be doing mathematics or anything of that sort. So the meme can bear the weight of this extraordinary powers of invention that the human mind has. And artists are the freedom of them, have the freedom of the meme in a way which most of us in our various professions don't. That also includes academics, who have to be very careful and stick within their discipline or receive great mockery. I don't say that at this moment the arts are looking as though they have the potential to help stabilize belief, help unify the species in the understanding that we are in a unitary and a singleton world, alone in a gigantic oceanic universe, possibly expanding forever, and possibly full of other people like us or unlike us. But the artist is really the only person who is free to imagine this spiritually, free to imagine this as images and other images interacting with images. And that's why I think the artist is just as important as the scientist. Both are pathfinders, really. And our science has run us into a world which we don't see and understand properly. We can we can see the dangers of it, but we can't manage them. We can't find a way of making our own risks tolerable. And the way that people used to, that was by ritual. There's only so much you can do, and particularly as the world moves into a new stabilized state where everyone is competing for the same ecology, for the same resources, and the capacity for producing surplus value to fund getting out of that situation into another is reduced, then the capacity to change our own psychology, to manage the world by dealing with it from the inside rather than from the outside, becomes greatly more important. And therefore there is this extraordinary opportunity now, I believe, for artists. I think they need to divest themselves of the present local fascination with identity politics. We are in a universe, and that's what matters. And so there's a lack of sérieux, I think, in the art that is just fortuitously being inspired by the various political movements, feminism, Black Lives Matter, and so on. All those things matter, but they are local to we human beings in our local society, and the opportunity now exists for an art which takes a larger view, which re-engages. In the 60s, people like Camus used to write about art in being more engaged, but it is an art which engages with the position of the species on the earth in the universe, a bit like those letters that school children used to write to their parents. Parents' name, home address, the world, the universe, and a 1 penny stamp on it. I think that the whole point of writing art history, after all, is not to record the dead, but is find the promise for the future. And I think art has this extraordinary promise for the future. It will do so in collaboration with science. But in the end, I think we'll find, just as we did in Stonehenge, which was a massive astronomical object, but it was the priests who got it there, and it was the priests who used it to manage the species in the cycle of the year, or for help the species manage to live in the rigorousness of the physical world. And if they believed in a god who brought the sun up, and so did the Aztecs for that matter, and even if they made sacrifices to help the god come up, well, we must look in the future about the sacrifices that we think are necessary, because there's never been a society without them. But that gives a slightly more serious bent, maybe, to art than would be recognized by one of those nice societies for the appreciation of art. But then art has always been much more serious than people thought it was. And I'm reminded by that particularly as a final image by my old friend and colleague, John Latham, of one of the founders of APG, in which I was involved for many years, the Artist Placement Group. And one day John got what looked extraordinarily like a bomb in the post. And he got it defused, and it wasn't a bomb, but it looked like one. And it carried the fears of one and the curses of one, so to speak. And it expressed an enmity from somewhere else within the arts, because he was doing what he was doing. Even art is serious. So I think that this time is not going to be managed by institutions unless people can institutionalize or achieve some consensuality about where they are, who they are, and in what kind of universe. Then I think one might have some chance of survival, but even that will involve rediscovering the value of mankind, rediscovering a meaning for life other than those sketched out by the religions, which tended to see you getting better after, having a better time after life, and capitalism, which just sees you getting richer. It is a time for the foundation of new institutions for the arts, really. In the back of my mind has always been the Institute for Cultural Evolution Studies, ICES. And I look forward to enlisting supporters for that, because looking at art in a purely synchronic way, just there's the image, and that's all I'm doing, gets us not very far. And in the end, art is too important just to be used for entertainment and scholarship. It's got to be packed back into our understanding of how life works. And then that makes it an altogether more important and more exciting reservoir of possibilities for the future.